Well, good morning and welcome to another exciting episode of the Mark and Suzanne Show. I am Mark. She is Suzanne. We are one day away from bouncing into 2019. And today we are going to do a year in review. And boy, a lot happened this last year. Like I said, I'm Mark. She is the better co-host and better part of the Mark and Suzanne Show. Suzanne, how are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Happy New Year. We're less than 24 hours away. I'm excited. We've got a lot to talk about wrapping up. You know, I know that we don't have you for the whole hour, Mark. You've got a lot of things going on, but I want to address some of the concerns that some followers have brought up with a perceived inconsistency on our take on the Constitution. And why are we saying that it enabled this tyranny? But I'm also complaining that the I guess abandonment of its principles are causing the problems we have today. These are not mutually inconsistent statements. We're going to address that in a little bit, but I want to remind people first, you can follow us on Facebook. We have a network page, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. And we also have a Twitter page, also Cerberus Radio Network, SoundCloud by the same name, YouTube page, also Radio Co. We have a loop. If you go to our page and just click, you can listen. We have programming 24/7. We have the Mark and Suzanne Show, Revolutionizing Radio. Daniel Bailey of the Bailey Report, he did an episode a couple weeks ago. I think he's hoping to get back into it. Paradigm Shift, Jeff Johnson, our producer, who's also in the studio today, is hopefully going to be getting back to some of those. Case in point, I have a few of those out by now. And the other day, Jeff and I recorded an audio version of a couple of the articles. One of my followers had said, you know, I really want to hear all you have to say on these published articles, but audio works better for me. So I said, you know what, we can get that down. We can get a couple of those out. So far, I've gotten 2 recorded with, again, the help of Jeff. The 10th Amendment article on the constitutional solution to immigration, which is very valid right now, or very relevant right now because of the whole discussion with the wall. In fact, our government has shut down. I never noticed the difference over this wall. So maybe we'll touch on immigration a little bit, as well as my article also from the 10th Amendment Center, Church of the National Government. So, Mark, let's get right into this while we have you. Is the Constitution just a piece of paper, and did the people and the government fail it? Or, as I like to argue, did the Constitution as written, not ratified and misinterpreted, enable what's going on today? And, you know, I think as we have gone through our discussions, we've kind of progressed from me later than you, from saying we need to get back to the Constitution to, well, wait a minute. Maybe it is working as intended and it was a Trojan horse. Back when you were talking about your Article 2 powers, I'm thinking, Cresslins, you big dummy. What are you talking about here? But that was really a wake-up call. Why don't you get back into that? And then because this goes beyond the typical general welfare, commerce clause, supremacy clause. We dig a little bit deeper here, getting into, again, the Article 2 powers and even the treaty powers, which we'll bring up while we got you on. I'll let you roll with that.
You know, in a weird kind of way, some of this came from the reality of having a disabled son. And let me explain the connection there. When you have a child that is disabled, as a parent and you deeply love your child, you go to root causes. You try to figure out what went wrong here. So with my son, who's had well over 20 surgeries, a medevac helicopter flight out of our front yard, near death on a few occasions, we have had to inquire the root cause of this problem. And so as I look at that, it probably gives me a little bit of a keen appreciation for the root cause of the problems we face today. Now, having said all that, there's a reality when we discuss the Constitution, anytime we discuss the Constitution, that there is a great deal of emotional connection to it. And I think sometimes we have to work doubly hard to step back and say, get up to 30,000 feet and say, what went wrong where? If we begin with the idea that a Constitution really is just a document to form a kind of government, give it certain powers, give it certain responsibilities, and we can take a more sterile look at it, well, now that puts us in a position to begin to understand its positives and its negatives. Sadly, because we've so this, in many ways, hyper spiritualized this, so hyper emotionalized it, we have a very difficult time criticizing. And I see this in my own life. My own journey has been filled with these moments of, gosh, is this even right to do this? Now, there's a whole host of reasons why that came about in our lives. But the reality is, this is a particularly awkward conversation in a weird kind of way, and it shouldn't be this way by any stretch of the imagination. It's a little bit like Christians hearing people criticize the Bible. It's almost at that level now. It's not right, because God's word is very, very different than the Constitution. Yet in so many people's minds, it's been elevated to nearly that level that criticizing it or critiquing it is tantamount to criticizing, critiquing the Bible. Folks, it's not. As much as we admire the founders and those framers in Philadelphia for their intellect, for their zeal to seek freedom, for their hopes in developing a form of government that would secure unalienable rights, they were not the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Peter, the Apostle James. They were men just like you and me, perhaps a lot smarter in many cases than you and me today, but they were just human beings, not under any special divine revelation that some would like to assume that they were. And unfortunately, when we ascribe those kinds of ideas to the Constitution, it makes it very hard to critique it. But now we live in the 21st century. And Don Livingston, to me, has probably made one of the best arguments to add a genuine critique to the Constitution. And it's really a very simple argument. It's about scale. Does it make any sense at all to have 545 people try to govern 320 million people, no matter how good the document is, whether it's this Constitution or some other Constitution? Does that really make any sense, knowing that there's 320 million unique individuals with unique tastes, unique ideologies about politics, unique views of community, unique views of vehicles? Why do we have Ford, GM, Chrysler, Honda, Toyota? Why do we have all those vehicles? Because people are different. They like different things. Why do we have so many different kinds of movies, from science fiction to horror to drama to all these things? Because people have preferences. The same holds true for politics, folks. And we are just silly naive to think that a document could possibly take into consideration the reality of 320 million different preferences. Don Livingston has actually scored the major blow to our form of government that came out of this Constitution. It is totally incapable of governing 320 million people. Otherwise, you end up where we are today. If we think it's a great idea, we're just going to keep fighting over control of Washington, D.C., and it's going to escalate, and it's going to get more and more violent. And if that's what you want, that's what this document, that's the government that came out of this document. So I don't hate the Constitution. I understand what it is. I understand that it's merely a document that organized a form of government. Now, we have to be mature enough to step back and say, is this form of government we have today capable of governing 320 million people? And I'll give you just one little anecdote associated with this. The guys over in the United Kingdom who were involved in UKIP and led the Brexit movement, they understood that Brussels was attempting to become the Washington, D.C. of the European Union. It's crystal clear. That was their argument. They understood that you could not have a few hundred representatives in Brussels, in the EU, governing 508 million people. They knew, they used language like, they will destroy the British culture. They will destroy what has been built for thousands of years or hundreds of years and on that little island out in the Atlantic Ocean. They understood that if Brussels got that power, they would wipe out who the British were. Folks, There is no monolithic European, just like there's no monolithic American today. We just have to desensitize think of a word, despiritualize or overhype the Constitution, because it blocks us from being criticizing it. And the result has been 63 million dead babies, folks. $22 trillion of stolen money from future generations, wars that have gone on incessantly and resulted in the destructions of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people's lives and property. Your property, no longer your property. If that's not enough evidence to take a step back, and the unemotional step back, and say, like I did with my son, why is my son fracturing his legs? Why is his heart rate at a young age well over 200 beats a minute? Why? If I didn't take a step back and say, what's wrong with my son would be dead now. But we were parents who loved our children and understood we needed to get to the root cause. Folks, we have massive problems in this country. If you think that it's going to be solved by Washington, D.C. and a construct that can govern 320 million people, well, I got nothing for you. I have no answer. Just keep going, and we'll slaughter another million babies this year, and we'll steal.
Listen to the Patriot Channel and complain about the Democrats all day long. Let's look at the accomplishments we've gotten under the Trump administration. And not all of the platforms that he campaigned on do I agree with. In fact, I really cheered him on because of his promise to withdraw troops. And as we know, recently over this Christmas break, we heard him say we're going to pull the troops out of Syria. And all of a sudden now Lindsey Graham is feeling okay with this plan after they had lunch together. What disturbed me was that we are pulling out not because we shouldn't have been there in the first place, which would mean a significant rollback for our policies and what we're doing with our troop presence everywhere, but because he said we defeated ISIS. And as you mentioned earlier, as for many of these problems government is creating, this government causes them. So why do we have a problem with ISIS over there? Probably because of our activities over there. I see Greg Carpenter, Junk Bond, has joined us. We'll probably get into that more after we run out of time with you, Mark. But, what you had mentioned earlier about letting go of our emotional attachment to the document, it's not going anywhere. It's still going to be in the archives in its little, container there in its enclosure. You can still go and see it. I took my boys in 2015, or I think in 2012, took my son and, looked at that. I revered it. Wow, this is amazing. You can still think that for its historic relevance. But what we have to get past is the fact that, there were some very intelligent people at the time that were vehemently against this. Mm-hmm. So you've got to let go. This did not come from God. We do have contingencies out there that say this is divinely inspired. I take exception to that. There's no evidence for it. But look back, we talk about here on the network, the Whiskey Rebellion all the time. The ink wasn't dry on the parchment before Alexander Hamilton abandoned his Secretary of the Treasury duties and became the Secretary of Defense and marched into Pennsylvania. He was supposed to have the request of the governor of Pennsylvania to do so, to quell this Whiskey Rebellion, which we've said before was, I think, a tax that was targeting the agrarian Jeffersonians. And Alexander Hamilton supported this. And I've heard this defended. Well, he was a general, and generals are problem solvers. And we needed to show Europe, so we could get credit, that the United States government was willing to do what it takes to collect a tax so we could be solvent and be a worthy credit risk. Well, my response to that was, well, to hell with the Constitution then, because we had rules for a reason. So what we've seen from the very beginning, in the order of expediency or for any other national interest, we're going to abandon the restraints. We saw that with the Louisiana Purchase. Even Madison said, well, we have to do this expeditiously or we might lose this window of opportunity. He didn't say it was completely constitutional. He said, we're kind of in a gray area here. Jefferson, till his last moments, agreed it was unconstitutional. So we've seen this from the very beginning. We have politicians today. We seem to take some sort of false comfort in the notion that our elected officials, representatives, I refuse to call them leaders, take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. Can anybody tell us why, if they're supposed to do that, they're even allowed to campaign on a platform that absolutely usurps it? We have no enforcement mechanism. Go ahead, Mark.
Listen, I'm going to have to beg out here in a moment. I want to leave with a quote, though, and it's one. I know people want to mock Lysander Spooner and ridicule him and try to delegitimize what he says, but here's what he said. He said, but whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or it has been powerless to prevent it. There's just a certain common sense to that. Either it authorized this thing that we have today, or it was wholly inadequate to prevent it. Those are just, folks, if you're listening to me and you can ratchet down the emotional connection to it, answer Spooner's question. Did it either create this or was it powerless to prevent it? Now, the immediate response is going to be, and I hear it all the time, no constitution is self-enforcing, except for examples where constitutions have been self-enforcing. So yes, you're right. And constitutions cannot self-enforce except when they are self-enforcing. For example, the Articles of Confederation was a self-enforcing document. It's why they had to overthrow it in a cryptic kind of meeting in Philadelphia, May through September of 1787. The Swiss Constitution is self-enforcing right now. Now, the people are in the process of changing it, and I don't have a problem with the people changing it. I have a problem with 545 people believing they can do whatever they want with it just because they got elected. That's a silly form of government. That is not representative government. This goes back to Don Livingston's argument. Does it really make any sense to believe that one person can represent 750,000 people in each House congressional district? Or does it make any sense that two senators can represent 40 million people in California and have it mean representation at all? It strains all credulity. You kind of have to suspend your intellect to say, oh, we have a representative form of government. No, you don't. They are representing, but it ain't you. It is special interests, big money, the vast military industrial complex. That's who gets represented in Washington, D.C. And how can I say that so authoritatively? Because I was a senior legislative assistant to two Republican members of Congress, and I saw it firsthand. So nobody can argue with me that there's representing going on, all right, but it ain't you. It ain't you. Trust me. So with that, I'm going to bid everybody a farewell for the year. Thanks, I will look forward to revisiting back here sometime in 2019. Blessings to you all. Thanks for showing up. Absolutely.
You know, just to continue on with what Mark was saying is take this a step further and do the math. The Supreme Court justices. How's that for representation? One of the main reasons we heard so many people saying we have to get Donald Trump in office is we need him to appoint Supreme Court justices who will overturn Roe versus Wade. Well, they got their first bite of the apple by having the opportunity to address whether or not states could stop funding abortions via Medicaid. And Kavanaugh sided with the folks that decided not to review this at all. So there goes their first opportunity. Congress keeps funding Planned Parenthood. We still don't have a wall. We'll get into whether or not we even should have a wall. But I want to bring Greg Carpenter in. Greg, I see you've joined us. How are you, my friend?
Well, good morning, and please apologize for my tardiness and entry into the show here. We've had quite the going on here at the Chateau de Carpenter since the Christmas season has begun. So our high point is 17 visitors, and our low point was 11. And I am the breakfast maker in chief. And my duties ran a little bit long today, and so I apologize for that. Making breakfast for 17 does take me a little bit of time, but I was able to accomplish that.
Okay, let me see. I have the menu right in front of me. Mimosas. I'm sure.
You know, Jeff,
I know you had that bubbly and orange juice. I know you did.
You know, Jeff, you read my mime very well. I did have Irish coffee, and I made eggs Benedict for the lot of them.
Now I'm getting hungry. Let's wrap up this topic though, because then we can get on to some other things. So what we're trying to address, and Jeff, can you maybe you've been listening since the beginning of the show. Do you think we clarified our point? You know, when we have all these discussions about what needs to be fixed, what's wrong, who's doing the wrong thing, who's doing the right thing, the whole discussion seems to be in the framework of the Constitution. Well, the president has the constitutional authority to enforce the borders. Well, no, he doesn't. So we have people that are claiming they're constitutionalists, they're conservatives, but again, they are erring on the side always of big government. Our good friend Andrew had posted something that I want to share with you. There are less than 20 powers delegated by the states to the general government. Congress has met for the purposes of creating laws to affect only those authorized purposes for 240 years now. So that begs a question. What the hell? It would be really nice if we adhered to the constitutional restraints. As we mentioned earlier with the Whiskey Rebellion and arguably the Louisiana Purchase, we failed to do so. So why is it we have people now, I think Elizabeth Warren is showing concern, or not concern, well, I'm concerned, but it's showing interest in putting her feathered hat in the ring for 2020. We know these people, Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, they come in and campaign on platforms in direct contravention to the Constitution, yet we have them stand up and then take an oath once elected, if elected, to uphold it. The Constitution is absolutely unenforceable. There's no enforcement mechanism, and we tolerate when the government doesn't abide by the rules, oftentimes because unelected Supreme Court justices or black-robed messiahs say it's okay, and they misinterpret the Constitution. Hence our discussion also with the difference between what the Constitution really means according to its history and the ratification conventions, and then what we call constitutional law. And sadly, when you tune into the majority, overwhelming majority, in fact, I can't think of another one except us, when they talk about the Constitution, they always take it from the constitutional law perspective, which will justify every single time government expansion. Jeff, I think you had some Patrick Henry in your toolbox here, because if we really thought that this was such an ingenious document that would prevent tyranny, why did we have some very brilliant minds raising the alarms and shouting the warnings from the very beginning?
Well, Suzanne, I just want to make sure I have this right. Was one of the complaints that we received that we're always knocking the document they say we want to get rid of? Was that kind of the complaint?
Well, on the one hand, you're inconsistent because you are saying that the Constitution caused tyranny. On the other, you are saying that the problem is people won't stick with the Constitution. And my point is, maybe it's my mind as an attorney, is you have to argue all positions. And they don't necessarily have to be inconsistent if you're trying to find a solution. So it's not inconsistent from a point that you're supporting your partisan politics, where if one side breaches the Constitution, it's okay as long as you agree with it, like say national reciprocity. But what I'm saying is, but for this document, we wouldn't have the problems today. It's like agreeing to a bad contract. So the terms could be written in such that they can be that they take tremendous advantage of the parties that were involved to their detriment. Does that make sense?
Well, because what I just wanted to make sure I knew exactly where that train of thought was. So when we sit and illustrate where people won't follow it, it's not because we're trying to enforce or get back to this idea that we just need to follow it. It's to show that it was incapable of keeping people from doing tyrannical things, whether it was Washington going into Pennsylvania with troops, or the Congress and the Senate passing the Alien Sedition Acts and Adams signing them, or whether it was Lincoln forcing states back into a voluntary union, or whether it's in this last century, the Federal Reserve or income tax or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. Whatever we're discussing these failures of people to follow it, it's to illustrate that whether by design or by omission, this document was incapable of keeping people from doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And at this point, does it really matter? Do you want to split hairs and explain why, or can we just admit that the experiment has failed? Even if you want to say man has failed it, okay, that's fine. Man's not changing. We have been so indoctrinated and so tied to this document, and the framework within the government has is people consider it synonymous with the American people. So when you talk about secession or decentralization, I've had people on K-Talk tell me, well, you want to ruin this country. The government's been in partial shutdown. I can still reach you. I'm sure I'm still accumulating federal tax obligations. Nothing's really changed here. And when we talked about the Whiskey Rebellion earlier, look, the general government marched in troops to a sovereign state to collect a tax. Good thing that never happened again, huh, guys? Greg, you've been awfully quiet back there.
Greg, it's really ironic when we're talking about General Washington marching troops into a state to collect the tax that perhaps wasn't even constitutional. We can, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. We can, if you go ask John Taylor Caroline, he may have had a different take on it. But here it is. We're not 20 years out from 1776, where we're leaving because of taxation without representation. And here we are getting taxation with representation. And they're sending troops to collect the tax. Kind of sounded like King George was King George.
I tell people who here's the thing also, if it was just a piece of paper, look, we had just a piece of paper before that was working pretty darn well, as Mark was alluding to at the earlier part of the show. I'm also reading Marshall DeRosa's book, The Confederate Constitution of 1861, an inquiry into American constitutionalism. And I haven't prepared all my notes from this yet, but it is really interesting to me that if something's just a piece of paper, well, we have a version that was improved. And that was the Confederate Constitution. Took great pains to make sure that the confusion that was set up in the original Constitution of 1787 was going to be alleviated. And they did a fantastic job doing it. So again, I think it can be done in a proper framework, but certainly going back to what Mark said about Don Livingston's argument about scale, the way Thomas Jefferson saw this country expanding, this union expanding, was not all of the states were going to become part of this union. Those themselves would split off and get smaller. They anticipated smaller governments. They understood the purpose of representation. Right now, people are fighting tooth and nail over who one executive position, who will be occupying that position. I anticipate, given Donald Trump's election in this last go round, we saw the viciousness of the of the election for Judge Roy Moore in Alabama. Allegations that were fabricated, they were fake, they admitted so after the fact. We had people that just absolutely hijacked the news over fake 30-year-old allegations of misconduct by Supreme Court Justice nominee Kavanaugh. I expect more of the same, and we are seeing ugliness of a magnitude. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but I shared on my page a video. I think you both might have seen it, of a gentleman that went into a vape store, and he had a shirt on that said Trump in big letters. The guy behind the counter, the employee, was absolutely unhinged. A curse fest, knocking things over, screaming at the customer to leave the store, calling him a racist, calling him every name under the book, a bigot, even assaulted him. He made personal contact. Eventually, the customer said, "Look, I won't call the police if you just sell me this. I need to get it from my wife. I want to come out. I want to leave and never come back." We've seen a teenage boy get physically assaulted and a hat taken off of his head and a drink thrown on him for wearing a hat that supported Donald Trump. It's going to be worse. We saw people at the election rallies during the election cycle before the election itself being assaulted for supporting Donald Trump. Do you think this violence is going to stop if he is reelected? What are your thoughts on that, Junk Bond?
I don't think the violence is going to end. I think it's all motivated and coordinated to make things more divisive. A few times um, about binary opposition and how you have one team against another, or you have two specific groups that are battling, all coordinated and designed to do this, and one group is better than the other, or the Republicans versus the Democrats, the liberals versus the conservatives. There's always two extremes. There's never any compromise or discussion, and that's something that Americans had been known for, their ability to compromise and to move forward back years ago. But now we're sitting in a situation where everything has to be very abrasive and abusive, and it really it designs a situation and a scenario so there is no solution. All there is more name calling and violence and problems, and it's not going to get better. I don't see it getting better. I remember a couple of years ago from there was a article in the Daily Mail UK, and it was, let me see, I just pulled it up again because I haven't gone through this in a while. This is March 2012. Police are investigating a possible hate attack after a 13-year-old boy was doused in gasoline and set on fire. The teenager, who suffered first-degree burns to the face and hands, is white, and his attackers are black. His attacker said, quote, "You get what you deserve, white boy." Now, if you look into the 90s and 80s, and you don't hear of things like this happening. I can't remember the last time that I heard of a 13-year-old get doused with gasoline and it not get covered in the quote national news, right? Well, only select things get covered in the news, and those things follow an agenda that serve the purpose of the higher powers, and the higher powers are run and coordinated by the Republicans and Democrats. I'm not a conspiracy person, but I can look at clues. I was an investigator for many years, and I can look at clues and say, "Oh, okay, that is what we call a clue," and it adds to the narrative that comes out of these guys. It's I would say it's embarrassing as an American
Really,
to have this type of a thing happen, and people just don't know what's going on.
when Obama was elected, when Eric Holder gave his first speech, his acceptance speech for Attorney General,
Yeah.
he called us a nation of cowards because we're not discussing race. You know why? Because we were getting along pretty darn well. These guys
Right.
fueled the flames and they instigated this. And what I had said at the time, not because I'm racist or any other thing like that, but I said, you watch, we are going to have, they are firing up the Black population, and they are going to make some violence happen here. What did we see? The flash mobs in all these urban areas. We had the flash mobs going in, the knockout game, white people getting assaulted. I had my friend Colin Flaherty, I interviewed him a couple times, and he documents all this black on white, black on everybody else violence. And I never really realized this until, I didn't see it really until we had Obama and Holder fueling the flames for this. The point is, people get upset when they don't feel like they have a say in their lives. And as we see now, this government gets its fingers into every aspect of our lives. And I've talked about this on my own land, where they come and they want to inspect my creek, or they're going to decide whether or not they can put a pipe through an irrigation ditch. And the chain of command went all the way up to the EPA. And I told the guy that was here, I never voted for you. We have an association of landowners here that has taken it upon themselves to manage land all on private property and manage how we're going to irrigate and water our lands. And somehow the EPA is going to get involved. This is why people are so upset. People get upset when they wait and wait for the right Supreme Court nominee to put forth their values. And then there is a disappointment once again. I haven't followed the news too much on our break, but I understand that the GOP representatives were investigating a conflict of interest and inappropriate handling of the Russia investigation by Mueller. What happened to that? Nothing. They said they ended it with no report. Did you follow that at all, Greg, Jeff?
I didn't follow it at all. And what I say to that is, there's another investigation. And what's going to happen? I mean, realistically.
Yeah.
We're not going to get anything that's going to be of any constitutional value for the people whatsoever out of this.
Here's more of the arrogance was when Comey was asked who funded the Steele dossier used to get the FISA warrants to serve the team. You know what he said?
Doesn't matter.
Who cares? Who cares? What difference does it make?
We got our man.
Yeah, the people that conduct these investigations, they're not looking for a solution. They don't care. The people that are asking these questions, this went back to the Bill Clinton testimony where he was asking them to define what a sexual act is, or that depends what is. The word is. And they let him get away with this.
Right.
What they should have said was, well, let's put it this way. If Hillary walked in the room, would you have been comfortable with her witnessing that act? They let him.
Well, that's a bad question to ask, because if he had said, if Hillary walked in the room, would you be comfortable with her witnessing that act? He said, I'm uncomfortable every time Hillary walks in the room.
Right. Exactly. But they get away with these questions. Hillary Clinton, when she was testifying about Benghazi, what difference does it make what causes, so long as American lives are no longer lost? What they should have done was put her feet to the fire and said, you just answered your own question. What difference does it make? American lives were lost. Now let's get to the heart of the issue. But by saying they just want to save American lives, they let her skate. And now Comey's doing the same thing.
This recent split decision from the Court of Gods and Goddesses, what do you call that? The Supremist Court.
Oracles.
The Oracales. They just had a 5-3 split decision, saying that the Fourth Amendment, something about the fruits of an illegal search now are legitimate.
Yeah, the police can use them. I forgot the exact circumstances, but once again, we have.
Now
Go ahead.
hold on. Now, doesn't this correlate to what Comey did? And isn't it curious that it comes up now and the Supreme Court says, no, it's okay, because this implies what Comey did was okay and legal also.
Well, I think as long as they're talking about themselves, I mean, this goes to the fallacy of assuming any branch of this government is going to rein itself in. So I don't care if you want to say that the document was a guarantee of liberty in perpetuity and it was the people who failed, or if you want to kind of come along where I'm starting to go right now is I think it's operating as it was intended to. Secretly, they knew that they were going to use this as a springboard upon which they could ultimately usurp the powers of the states and invert the federal system into a top-down national system. Regardless of how you look at it, this is where we are. We have no representation. This is why I always say, if you want to just hold the course and vote harder, vote Republican, wait for the Supreme Court to vindicate our rights, be they First Amendment, Second Amendment, and direct contravention to our founding principles, you go ahead. But you're not going to solve any problems. So we might make you a little uncomfortable when we talk about this stuff here, but this is why we have a following that's growing that says,
Isn't that the plan? I mean, isn't that the plan? You stick to the party line, vote Republican, and because that way you'll be dead before it matters.
Well, and it is only a matter of time, isn't it, before the so-called patriots are replaced by the indoctrinated future generations in the public school system, and they fight us at every front. So if you want to homeschool, what do we have now? Well, we have compulsory education. Well, we're going to get around that. We're going to homeschool, but they make the laws so prohibitive if you want to do it right. For instance, in California, you can homeschool, but you have to follow what they call, you have to file an R4 affidavit. That's when I was doing it. And I looked into what was involved in filing that. You essentially become your own private school, and then they cannot research or check on you and your progress and your testing and that sort of thing. But the burdens of filing one of these, it was crazy. You had to set up a separate answering machine. So everything, according to the outside world, looked like you were a brick and mortar traditional school entity. The filing and everything else. It was.
Wait. Hold on a second. What? Pardonnez-moi, mademoiselle. What does having a freaking answering machine have to do with educating your child?
And you had to have an outside record keeper. This was crazy. So I thought, I'm not going to do this. So when I moved to Utah, well, you can homeschool, but you have to register with the district, and you also have to abide by the state standards and do the same amount of hours and the same topics as the public education system. And I said, no.
What does that matter then?
Exactly. So what they'll do by making school attendance compulsory, and then by making you have to follow along their guidelines, that ensures that you are going to be teaching the same subjects. Again, very much in contravention to accurate history. And I saw that when I was purchasing materials. Even when you're homeschooling, you have to be very careful what you're looking at. So again, the whole point of public education, going back to the Prussian system, was to indoctrinate future generations and make them compliant. Let's talk really quickly about some of the top stories of 2018 and what we look like, what we're looking forward to 2019. I think a huge story was the evolution of the secession movement. In November, in Dallas, I attended an event and I got to meet Mark Kreslins for the first time, and Don Livingston. The Abbeville Institute hosted the symposium on the revitalization of nullification and secession. Cal Exit is a big movement. Yes, California is probably the biggest part of that movement. Governor Cuomo just last week announced that New York State is now no longer part of or under the control of Washington, D.C. This movement is growing. This is what we saw. We were talking about Brexit earlier on. We are seeing a homegrown, organic movement to decentralize and get out from under Washington, D.C. Go ahead, Greg.
That's going to be a problem. I mean, New York State being its own separate entity. I don't think we funded enough money for the wall around New York and New Jersey. I'm sure New Jersey is going to go too, along with Connecticut, just like they tried to do back in 1815. And I say, good riddance.
And this is the thing. Some of the false information we have to get the people that are fighting these movements to understand is the war against Southern independence, also known as the Civil War, falsely named as the Civil War, changed nothing. I say this all the time, probably every show, but as we're getting new listeners, I will repeat myself. At the time the Constitution's ratification was being debated, 3 states, and I actually quoted the one from New York Ratification Convention on my page the other day, reserved the right to leave this union should it no longer suit them. These were principles, again, set forth in the Declaration of Independence. So states being New York, Rhode Island, who, by the way, didn't even send delegates to Philadelphia in the first place. Patrick Henry smelled a rat.
Yeah, they knew better.
Yeah, he was right. And Virginia said, look, if this doesn't suit our purposes, we are going to reserve the right to leave. Otherwise, we're not going to ratify that. That condition being accepted was applicable to all the states. If you need to change a fundamental part of the Constitution, there's a means by which to do so. It is not war. It is not a Supreme Court judicial temple monkey opinion, Texas versus White, saying that it is illegal unless the other states agree or you get permission.
I know that one, 1868. I know that one.
You get a cookie. You need a constitutional amendment to make secession illegal. So I tell people all the time, and I tell our good friend Marcus Ruiz Evans from Yes, California, I understand your strategy. You want to get the other states on board, but just so you know, you don't need it. So I see decentralization. I see the movement being galvanized. We have to unite with the people that we supposedly hate and who supposedly hate us because, as you talked about the binary opposition, Greg, the central government, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, those in charge who do not represent us want us fighting each other tooth and nail, because then we ignore the Federal Reserve. We ignore our system of fiat currency, which is based upon nothing and can come crashing down anytime. And we keep fighting each other and get nothing done. What we talk about on our group, Peaceful Political Divorce, and also on the Yes California page, is we have got to put this anger and hostility directed at each other aside and focus on the common enemy who's over in the swampland occupying that 10 square miles in DC and get out from under them. Nobody's advocating a violent or otherwise overthrow. We're just saying we want to leave. That was the point of the War of Southern Independence. Secession itself did not cause the war. It was the government's reaction to the lawful actions of the Confederated States of America. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Lincoln in his inaugural address pretty much said, you know, how would you do it? As a WWE prize fighter, if that was Lincoln was saying, I'm going to mess you up. I'm going to take you. I am going to tax the beep out of you, and we're going to screw with you as much as we can. But don't forget, we're here. We're brothers, and we love each other. Now, how do you intimidate people like that and then come back and say, well, it was their fault?
Well, and that's how we get the fault narrative. Well, they fired on Fort Sumter. So I see this as being a huge story in 2018. It's not covered by the media. I anticipate some activity that is going to bring this to the forefront in 2019, where the media will not be able to ignore this any further. I think one of the platforms and promises of candidate Trump was to get the troops out of Syria, Afghanistan. I again, he's said that we're going to leave Syria because ISIS was defeated. To me, and your mileage may vary, Greg, but I think that leaves the door open to another supposed attack. Call it a false flag, whatever you want. Oh, ISIS isn't defeated. Or I think he also said, "Don't worry, we can still get to them from Iraq." So I'm not feeling very confident right now. When the premise is, well, we defeated ISIS. No, what we need is a moral declaration that what we are doing over there is wrong. Would you be willing? Hey, we're drafting the girls too. Do you have a member of your family you are willing to sacrifice? Which ultimately, I think we know our involvement over there is regime change to get Assad out. Would you be willing to sacrifice one of your children to get that accomplished, Greg?
No, 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 never. I don't think there's a reason for it. I don't think we should be messing around. I mean, I do think that declaring the victory over ISIS actually can help legislators here understand the budgetary process. Simply because number one is we use the CIA to fund and stand up ISIS. We continued to fund ISIS for the last decade. And number three, we use the Army Rangers against Special Forces. The Army Rangers were with a different group, and the Special Forces and CIA were with ISIS. And they would fight each other. We've created our own proxy war, per se, our own contained regional conflict, where we can continue to pump up the defense industrial base and continue to pump money into them. I think Trump has stumbled upon something very unique here. Is if you cut the budget line for an organization, they dry up and go away. And now it'll take time to see, if Congress actually cuts the money out of the ISIS budget and how long it takes them to dry up and go away. But maybe in direct opposition to Trump, Congress will continue to fund ISIS, which will mean that the war, definitely isn't over, so they can fund all their buddies in the defense industrial base.
The real winners of these wars, by the way. I don't think
always the winners. I was just watching another document. I went to see what the heck was that? The documentary that Peter Jackson just did on World War One. They are not lost, or they are not, something like that. I forget what it is. And it was he took old World War One footage and colorized it and made it 3D, and then hired lip readers to identify what it is that the soldiers were saying. And they added crowd noise effect. They added real artillery, gunshots from the same types of rifles that were used, everything to recreate what was happening in World War One. And my jaw hit the floor. It was unbelievably amazing. And being this the 100th year of the armistice of World War One, and noting that we completely lack any awareness of what happened back then, my awesome wife Shu Ping went out and picked up a 16-hour documentary for my father and I to watch, and we're through about 8 hours of it. And the horridness, the atrocities of 41 million people dying, 20 million of them civilians, the gas, the artillery, I was really shocked and moved on how horrible World War One really was compared to, just being a brushover of history. And one of the things that they covered in this documentary was the economic impact and the importance and to the financing and how the different armies were financed. And it turns out that most of the American and British bankers, the big names that we all know of, the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, families like this, the Rothschilds, all of these people invested tons of money through the banking system to fund our troops, the British troops, the Germans, the Austrians. They funded both sides of World War One. They made tons of money off the war. So I went back and I did a little more research, and I found it was these same families, the same banks. Some of them had shut down, like the Rockefeller Trust, and changed names. But the continued legacy of where they came from and who owned them was the same. And it was the same people that funded both sides of World War II. It's almost unbelievable to think that our central bank here, the Federal Reserve, funded the Nazis during World War II, but they did. And these are things that don't necessarily get brought up in daylight or in places where people talk about nice and pleasant things. But we're doing these things to ourselves. When we get caught up emotionally in these discussions, we lose sight of who's the real winner and who are the real losers. The winners are very few, and the losers are millions and millions of us.
Well, I think the two quotes come to mind when you're going through this is Smedley Butler, General
Smedley
said, "All war is a racket."
It's a racket. It's not a tennis racket.
And
it's not a squash racket. It's just a general racket.
There's no coincidence that the greatest century of warfare and deaths worldwide comes at the same time as the emergence of central banking. So those are some of the major stories for 2018. We had the absolute debacle of the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for
Kavanaugh.
And at the same time, conservatives completely caught up in the left's indignation, abandoned and ignored the constitutional Fourth Amendment issues that I felt were very concerning. In fact, I wrote an article published by the 10th Amendment Center called, I think, Botching the Fourth Amendment. But it's on there where people just were not concerned. And even people told me, Suzanne, you're just so stupid. You can't say third party. The third party doctrine, of course, is outside the purview of the Fourth Amendment. Well, you know what? Good luck trying to communicate with somebody these days outside that. So what we're saying now is, well, it's okay for them to technologically do what they couldn't do with just a letter opener and look at all our correspondence. So I see that we are embracing any Supreme Court justice that Donald Trump can order. I know Ruth Bader Ginsburg is on the radar now. And so we'll see. We'll look at that. It'll be interesting to see next year who is going to start showing interest in competing for the next 4 years. My personal opinion, and I really hope and pray that Donald Trump is reelected, not because I support any kind of king, but I think that the secession movement needs more time. I think that if a Democrat president is elected, it will take the pressure off states like New York and California to feel the need to secede. I will say, Marcus Evans has had this organization going for about 10 years. This isn't just a knee-jerk reaction to a Trump presidency. That being said, I would like them to be dissatisfied a little bit longer so we can get this message going, because if we can get behind these blue states and their desire to leave, I guarantee you some conservative factions will open up where people will be delighted to join. We're about 1 minute out. Go ahead, and then we're going to have to wrap up the show. Go ahead.
Let me just throw in my top story of 2018 very quickly here. And it is the fact that Puerto Rico, if you remember Puerto Rico, it's a protectorate of the United States territory. They had no electricity for 11 months. And they received more help from the rest of the world than they did from the States. Now, if that doesn't tell you something about how things are going to go for us in the future, then you obviously are not paying attention to what's really going on behind the scenes.
prepare, prepare, prepare. That's why I like to combine the two topics. You know, I just posted an article the other day about the vulnerability of the power grid. Greg, you and I have discussed that before, but we will be back in 2019. We've got a lot of great topics. I think a lot of things in the news to cover. I want to thank those of you that have been loyal and sharing our posts and listening. We've got a lot planned for you for next year. I'm Suzanne Sherman, Greg Carpenter, Junk Bond, Jeff Johnson, Mark Cressland's here at the beginning of the show. This has been the Mark and Suzanne Show, Revolutionizing Radio, our year-end extravaganza on the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Happy New Year.